Okay, before I start talking very much, I want to mention that Matt Stevens, Jennifer's husband, was also in the service. I think maybe 3 or 4 years, and he was Air Force peacetime. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Branson, where we had the reunions. And the first year we went down to we flew into Springfield, Illinois, and then drove down. And on the way down, we'd heard about the mountains down there, and so Kenny asked him. He said, "Where's your mountains?" And they said, "Well, you're in them." Well, they aren't as high as some of our hills here in Oregon. But anyway, we drove on down into Branson. In this first reunion, the motel got things mixed up, and they had two different Navy people had applied for reunion, and the other ones came a week early, and they got everything that the motel had planned for us. But anyhow, they did get acquainted, and there wasn't too many there this time, but they got acquainted and kind of told stories about each other and so on. And that year, they did spend a lot of time together. And one wife said, if every unit was like this one, they didn't know how they ever won that war. But anyhow, we had a good time getting acquainted. And like I say, I think we went back 5 or 6 times. So these things I'm saying may not be in order, but these are things that we done while we were there. The second year we went, Emil and Viola went with us, and we spent a lot of time sightseeing and driving around. But every evening, everybody'd get back to the motel, and they'd have some kind of a entertainment or talk together. And the second motel we were in, they really catered to us. I mean, it was open 24 hours a day, and it was ours to use as we wanted. Of course, other visitors there came in for the continental breakfast and so on, but there was always someone in that room. Well, anyway, like I say, we did sightseeing the second year. And one thing we did, and I think it was more or less to say we'd been in another state, we drove to Arkansas. Now, I don't know just how far it is down there, but it was quite a little ways. And all the way down there, these houses, they just looked really, really run down and like the hillbillies. That's what they said they were. But in front of every house, pretty much every house, there was a quilt. They were beautiful quilts, and you could stop and buy one or go on. And a place where they lived, it looked like that they were stills there, and maybe they were. I know they were raided a lot, and maybe they were still bootlegged. I don't know, because there was absolutely no liquor, wine, beer sold in Branson. And so maybe the stills were still working. Well, anyway, as we went on down to Arkansas, we came to this town finally, and it was built on a hill. It was probably, I don't know. Anyway, there was no straight street in that town. It was just like you were winding around and around and around. And there were churches, lots and lots of churches, and they had real high top steeples. And we drove around and we saw this one church, and the steeple was on the ground, and it had a welcome sign out in front. So we stopped and come to find out it was a Catholic church. And so you walked in the side door of the steeple, and then we walked down 8 or 10 steps. And you came to the vestibule of this church that was built completely underground. and you could buy souvenirs, rosaries and candles or prayer books or whatever. And from the vestibule, why they had two big glass doors, and when you opened it, that's where the church was. They had pews on each side. Now this wasn't a big church, but it wasn't a little church either. And they had some kind of lights. They looked like candles. I think they might have been artificial or something, but there were lights. But there were a lot of lights on the altar, and it had real religious windows. Of course, you couldn't see out because you were down underground, and that was different. So we spent time in there, and then on the way back, why we took the highway back rather than go on the back roads like we came down. And when we got back there, why one of they had one main street through Branson. There was one the first year we went through. There was one way in, and if you wanted to go anywhere, you had to go down Main Street before you could turn off. Well, one of the years, next year or so when we went, they were making roads around the north side of Branson. And along there is where all the music theaters were. And they were tall and they were big. And they were, most of them were on the north side of town. And there was a few along Main Street, but they weren't near as, what do I want to say, as big and famous as ones back there. And pretty near every one that ever went to the Grand Ole Opry had their own theater there. And these were strictly just for music. You could buy tapes and videos, things like that. And they might have had pop machines, but you didn't eat anything in there. One of our favorite ones I'll tell about when we went to see Mill Tillis. And usually when the group wanted to go, they'd pick their own theater, and two or three couples would go together. Well, on this one, there was a lot of us. There must have been 30 people or so went to this Mill Tillis one. And one of the sailors, and whenever we went like this, why they always wore their sailor hats. And one of them, for some reason, took an extra hat along, and he got to go backstage, and he gave it to Mill Tillis. And before the performance started, why the announcer come out and would introduce different groups that were there. And he'd start in, this group was from so-and-so. Well, when he started to introduce our group, why Mill Tillis come out and he said, "I'll handle this one." And he said, introduced them as the ones from Saipan. And he said, my director said I couldn't wear this hat during the show. But he says, I'm going to be one of the good old boys, and I'm going to wear it. And and he did. He wore it all during that show. And during the intermission, why he came out where we were. And, of course, most of us got his address and his autograph. And he signed the sailors' hats, all except one. Well, Billy Joe, can't remember her last name. Anyway, Bill. Anyway, she sang and she came down with him, and they got a bouquet of flowers for her. Well, she thanked him for the flowers, but she said, "I want to be a good old boy too. I want a sailor hat." So the one sailor that had his autograph gave her his hat. So she said, "The director's not going to like us," but she said, "I'm wearing this hat too, and I'm wearing it tonight." And so they did. They went up, and then after the show was over, they came down again. Billy Joe Spears it was, and they came down and they spent quite a while with us. And this was one of our favorite ones that that we went to. Uh, I didn't tell you before, Kenny made a myrtle wood clock. And he took this back, and when they introduced us, they introduced us every time we went down there. You had to get up and tell who you were and where you came from and all this. And so Kenny presented this clock to Art King, and he said he brought that for them to help uh, with the expenses. Maybe they could sell tickets or something on this. Well, one of these fellows, as soon as he saw the clock, he took out a $20 bill, and he said, "I want $20 worth of tickets." Well, Art said, "Well, you're going to have to wait a while till we even get the tickets or sign up our names or anything." And so every year after that, Kenny would take a clock and pretty near everyone that was stationed on Saipan got a clock, and one fella ordered one because he wasn't ever lucky enough to win one. And so Kenny said, "Well, I'll see what I can do." So he sent him one at Christmas and said, "Merry Christmas." And Gene said, "But he said, you put a price tag on it." So Kenny wrote on there, "It's yours." And about 2 or 3 weeks later, Kenny got a $50 bill in the mail. There was a man named, they called him Moon Man. And what he did, I don't know, but he was a big fella, and he was the one that was going to win that clock. Well, the year that Viola and Emil went with us all the way back, she said, "I'm going to win this clock." And she did. So Kenny said, "Well, Moon Man wanted this clock so bad." He said, "You give it to him and I'll make you one." So she did. Well, he wanted to pay her for it, and of course, she wouldn't take it, and Kenny made her a clock later. But anyway, pretty much everyone got one of these clocks, and they'd auction them off. Outside of Branson, there was a place called Sleepy Hollow, and it wasn't a town, and I don't know what you'd really say it, but it had strictly like it used to be years ago. They had imitation stills there, and they had shows, and the theaters were just like boards, straight wood. They weren't fancy or anything, and they'd have different shows. One of them that we went to, why it was like dance hall girls, and they got up there and danced. That was and it was all country western, and all the men that you'd see around there wore overalls. They were the blue and white striped overalls. Even the people in the stores, they wore that, and most of the women wore long dresses, and they kind of talked with the I don't know, kind of a dialect, I guess. And in this Sleepy Hollow place, why, they had gun shoots every once in a while, and sometimes you'd be walking down the street, and they had the good guys and the bad guys. Well, they would kind of kidnap you, and you were either a good guy or a bad guy, and in these shootouts. And also, when you first went into Sleepy Hollow, there was a long wagon, and it was pulled by horses. And you could take a buggy ride or a wagon ride and go up in the hills and so on. And that's where they had these imitation stills up there, and they had sheriffs all over the place. Well, at night, they had a play called Shepherd of the Hills. Now, this is an old story, because Dad said that when he was teaching school, why, he read this book, but I don't think he read it to the kids. But anyway, if you ever get a chance to see it, it's really something. It was out on an outdoor stage, and they would have the horses racing around, and it was a murder story. And I guess it was kind of based on true facts to start with. And of course, there was a feud between the two families. And I don't know how they did this, but they had a kind of a log cabin there. And every show, they'd set that log cabin on fire and it had burned. And the next night, the log cabin was there again. So I guess they put some kind of repellent on there that would put this fire to burn real fast and then it'd go out. Well, that part of the stage was dark and you never saw the log cabin again. But anyway, that was another thing that we saw. And also in Sleepy Hollow, well, you could, when you came in, they had this wagon ride I talked about, and it'd go up in the hills, and then when you come back, why, you'd get out and go to your own. Well, there was all kinds of things going on. They saw logs and so on, and there was no restaurants there. You might have been able to buy a hot dog or a hamburger, but as far as a restaurant or something like that, they didn't have it. They had one place for little kids to go on slides, and kind of a recreation place, and it was just outside of town there where it was. So we went back. I think we went 5 times, and one time when we went, like I say, we usually flew into Springfield, but one time we got on a bus and we drove up to St. Louis, and that's where Judy and Frank lived. And I always wanted to see the arches that go into St. Louis. And so we did. They took us there, and we got to go up to the top of the arches. Another time, after we rented our car, we drove, and I don't know just where it was, but it wasn't too far from Springfield, but it was people that had lived in Kansas. So we spent a couple of days with them. And another time we landed in Kansas City. We rented a car there, and we drove and stayed all night at Larry Bill's, and then drove from there to Branson. Well, on the way, there's a cave, and it's kind of like the other caves we've been to, like there was one in Wyoming and so on. Well, this cave, they started exploring it around World War I, and when the war came, why, the exploring just stopped. And what really started it, these miners had seen a little dog playing in front of this cave, and miles away, people on the other side that lived over there found this little dog. Well, anyhow, then the miners started exploring it, like I said, and during the war it stopped. Well, there was either 6 or 8 women decided that they would explore it. And they had pictures there, and these women wore the lights around their heads like the miners did, and they carried the miners' ladders. And these women wore real heavy, long skirts, and they wore buttoned-up shoes. And they explored this cave and found the way through, and I don't know how long it took them. But anyway, we went through this. We rode on a cog train, and there were tunnels that went off from this main thing that we were on, and it was boarded up because those weren't explored yet. And when we got in the middle of this cave, where they turned out the lights, we'd been traveling, was just a little bit lighter than twilight, and they turned it, and it was pitch dark. And the driver of this train thing, he threw a rock over. He said, "Now listen." And it took several seconds before that, and it sounded like it hit water. And they said that so far they had not reached the bottom of this. And they had those, what do they call, stalactites or something, coming down from the top, and then they grew up from the bottom. And we were on this track, and it wasn't too wide. To tell the truth, I was glad when we got through with it. And then we drove on into Branson. And this was, they had decided that this would be our last one because, well, Kimmy and Art, they were in their 70s, and they were, like I say, the youngest. And some of those fellows were 27 or 28 when they were stationed on Saipan. And at that time, there were a lot of stories told because this was supposed to be the last meeting. And one of the fellows wrote poems, and the name of the poem was Time to Say Goodbye. And it was a tearjerker, let me tell you. In this poem, he told about the things that they'd done on Saipan and the dangers they went through. And when he got through, I don't think there was a dry eye there, but anyhow, it got really, really quiet. And one of the older sailors said, well, maybe we could have one more. And they did. They said, but it won't be 2 years, it'll be just a year. And I think everyone that was possible able to come came. But there were lifetime members, friendships that were there, and they kept in touch over the telephone a lot. But that was the last one that they went to.